Good afternoon. Well, we have a quorum. Now we just need our chair.
I'm in a vehicle, so please note that that's why I am not on screen, because this is not the most ideal time to have a meeting for me. Thank you.
You've got one participant on via telephone. I don't know if you were expecting that, but just wanted to let you know.
That's LD.
And if that's the case, do you want me to enable that microphone?
Oh, please do.
Yep.
We've had technical difficulties regarding him. If we can confirm.
And it just dropped off. But I'll look for that number again. And I'll be in the background if you need anything.
Thanks, sir.
Gentlemen and gentle ladies, hello, hello.
Greetings.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey there.
Phil, this is a policy subcommittee meeting, is that correct?
This is a policy subcommittee meeting. Oh, policy subcommittee chair.
Is Ridge joining us?
Ridge should be joining us. He said he was free after 3:30, which I take to mean that he was busy until 3:29:59. So we'll give him a minute or two.
So I'm assuming you'd like me to chair the meeting?
I would assume, and I'm assuming you'd like me to tell you what we're doing.
I think I know what we're doing, but before we get into any of that, let's wait a minute or two. Let's officially call the meeting to order, and then we can talk about the order of business.
Yeah. Ridge and I just left the University Community Working Group meeting. It just ended at 3, and I did it virtual. He was there on the campus, so he's probably squirreling to get back to his office or somewhere. So.
Corner at 3 o'clock on a Friday.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So,
All right, well, I'll go ahead and officially call the meeting to order. This is a meeting of the Housing Advisory Committee Policy Subcommittee. I believe we have, what do we peg for the meeting duration today? An hour and a half, Phil? Is that right?
1 hour.
1 hour.
Right. And this is, yeah. And
Okay, and as I understand our remit, we were tasked by the city manager's office to look at the list of recommendations in the housing plan and prioritize ones that could be accomplished within a short duration. Is that correct, Phil?
yeah, so in essence, to take a one step farther up on this, Vice Chair Sully Yates and I and Sam Sanders met last week to discuss the implementation of the HP and the development of, as we did at the last HAC meeting, a sort of a working group to sort of task out the various programs and sort of see what was needed for each of them and sort of stand up basic frameworks for them. But ahead of that, city management is looking for a very broad look at priorities and order based on fiscal year. And in part, what they're looking for is things that we think we can stand up in the calendar year of 2021 and make progress with it. Number one. Number two, things that can make some progress sort of by the end of fiscal 2022. And then stuff after that. The idea there is for the quote stuff after that, that's where we can really get into the meat and potatoes of real budgeting on it. And that is a prelude to then part two. So the idea behind this meeting is let's to sort of have a discussion about how to figure that out. And then, get to work on that. We don't imagine, Lyle and I didn't think we'd get this done today, but at least we can have a discussion about how to chop this up looking at the AHP. And then we would meet again and sort of discuss this with the HAC next week and get sort of a rough list into the city manager's office ASAP. And then that will determine how they can point things at the broad level. And then we start backing and filling from there. So it's a prelude to sort of the remit of this ad hoc working group. Does that make sense?
Lyle, anything to add to that? Okay. All right, well, I would suggest that we do this. First of all, I don't know that I can see if there are members of the public who have joined us. Is anyone the host who can actually see that? Brian?
In theory, can do that. So let me see if I can get to where I need to be to do that.
Dan, there is
Brian,
no audience right now.
Right.
There is no audience right now. Is that right, Brian?
Right.
Correct.
And Brian,
Brian,
could you promote?
Could I ask you, Brian, if people do join us, that you can either send in the chat or let me know, because we tend to like these meetings to actually be open and flowing, and we welcome people's comments as we have conversation. If there's an ability to do that, would that be possible so that people could raise their hands and we can call on them to be part of the conversation?
Absolutely.
All right.
You could promote Dan so he can see all of that stuff. That'd be helpful.
Done.
By the power of Grayskull, et cetera.
Well, I would suggest that we do this. I shared my screen. Can everybody all the panelists see the screen? This is a worksheet for there's actually one as I scroll up for the sort of 5 significant categories of recommendations in the housing plan. And so I would suggest, and so let me again, just be clear, Phil, that are we looking to actually start to fill this out and talk content, or are we talking just about process today? What is your pleasure?
So my thought, subject to the will of the committee, was to talk about process on how we're going to put these three, think about what goes into these 3 buckets now by the middle of next year and after that, and think about how we organize that and maybe even start organizing that. But I don't think we're going to get much further than just trying to figure out how we're going to make the decision. And it's probably a lot of homework assigning for people.
I would think, well, I mean, one of the things that probably makes sense is to make sure that we're all dealing from the same sheet of music. So this isn't inventing solutions whole cloth. I think we want to be pulling them from the actual, well, I think we know we need to pull them from the actual document, because that is the document and the policy that council has voted on. That's the official policy of the city. And so I don't know if we want to review those now or send that as homework for people to review. I mean, I think some of these things, to be perfectly honest, are, especially the immediate ones, are fairly obvious, I think. And so I would like to, at least during this hour, to sort of check that assumption and see whether the things that appear obvious to me are also obvious to the other panelists. Because if there are things that we can kind of bank and say, hey, there's consensus around this, we don't need to talk about it anymore, I'd rather do that and then reserve time in later meetings to hash out the tougher stuff. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
All right, so Lyle, I think you shared, I think you just sent the housing plan, is that right? A link to
I
it?
did in the chat.
If I unshare my screen, could you pull up on the screen the list of recommendations per these general categories: funding, governance, land use, tenants' rights, and have us just very quickly review them, even if it means me just, and I know this is boring as heck for attendees of a meeting, but even just have me read them down so that we're all on the same sheet of music. Are you able to do that?
Who is
If
you?
I stop.
You or you?
You, Lyle.
I know I did not have that power, so I would need to be promoted.
Oh, you can't share screen? Okay, well, I think I can. Let's see.
Everybody should have the share screen option.
I
the
just
green-
changed my screen. Do people see the,
It's the green button at the bottom of the screen if you need
I
it.
see it.
Lyle.
do people see the, what I just changed my screen to? It says subsidy and purpose at the top of the screen. Or-
Uh,
Now it
Yes.
just says subsidy,
Yep.
yeah?
Yeah,
I see.
can you make it bigger? A
Can
little
I
bit
make it bigger? Well, that's a good question. I don't know how to zoom the Zoom.
All right,
Uh,
don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I have the book, the thing inside. No.
Let me pull up what I think is the appropriate section, and I'll just, if it's okay with you all, I'll just read through it. Just so that we have a public record, so people who have taped this we're all sort of dealing with the same potential kit of parts. And Phil, I don't know, this shows up in multiple times in the document. In the executive summary, it's kind of rolled up. And then it later, it's a little bit more detailed. Would you have me read the executive summary or the more detailed bullet points?
I think, don't they have a section that is implementation order? Don't they have their own version of this? I mean, but I mean, I think the executive summary is probably sufficient, but
All right, well, let me start with that. And if that's not detailed enough. So they break the executive summary. Can everyone see where the cursor is, where it says funding, make a strong recurring financial commitment?
right.
On
That is
on the next slide, under funding recommendations, there are a number of high-level recommendations. One is dedicated 10 million per year to fund affordable housing. Make this consistent and understandable. Target extremely low-income households. Attach funding awards to community representation, duration, affordability, and leverage of non-public funding, etc. And clearly identify overall housing expenditures. So those are the sort of the things to act on now. Under governance, it's reform structure and function of Housing Advisory Committee. Appoint a committee and give its priorities for the distribution of the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund. The next one is about improving city staff capacity, and then to standardize the funding process. Then land use, there are a number of items, including allowing more multifamily by right and soft density by right, enabling accessory dwelling units, and creating inclusionary zoning. And then in tenants' rights, enhance tenants' rights in the policies of the city for any project that uses rental project that uses city money. Create a funding dedicate funding for a right to counsel. Then there's an advocacy component of putting on our legislative agenda, the enabling legislation to support just cause evictions, and then rent control, trying to enable legislation for rent control. Then in terms of subsidy, there's support LIHTC, support funding for modernizing public housing units, create an acquisition fund to preserve existing affordable housing, create or establish a land bank, continue the use of tenant-based housing vouchers, create a permanent eviction prevention fund, significantly enhance down payment assistance, look into an employer assisted down payment assistance program, encourage CRHA to utilize some Section 8 capacity towards home ownership, look into local mortgage pool through the IDA program, enable single family and soft density infill development, and then create owner occupied rehabilitation assistance, and then continue with tax relief. Then after that, there's a snapshot of implementation, which kind of does some of the work I think that you're suggesting that we do. And so I guess I will then throw a question to you, Phil. Are they looking, is city manager looking for us to simply vet this snapshot of implementation, or kind of augment it? Tell me again a little bit more about what the city manager wants us to do.
Right. So my read of this is that the snapshot of implementation, of course, is the consultants throw down for, well, this makes a sensible way to do it. And we recognize that, but that we are probably going to scramble this up a bit, that there are things that we've already done, that there are things that we can't do quickly, that they have sort of at the front end. There are things that they have towards the back that we might be able to implement, because the ground has, of course, shifted. This summary was produced essentially at the beginning of the year, and things have changed. And our implementation priorities may have changed too. So my sense is that we take the snapshot of implementation and we do at a minimum a fairly heavy edit.
Gotcha. All right, so let's start then with funding, and I'll open it up for discussion. I've got up on the screen, I'm sure it's probably small, so people have a hard time reading it. I'm sorry. If I knew how to make it bigger, I would. But I've got up on the screen the snapshot, the executive summary of funding recommendations. There was nothing in the implementation plan for the first 6 months, although those first 6 months are pretty much done. So I think we're kind of in the second 6 months. So what I would ask is for people to take a minute or two to read through that and see if there's some obvious things. Let's start with each one of these categories. Let's start with obvious immediate things, things that can be accomplished within 18 months. And let's just start with those two things and forget the longer range things for now. And let's see if we can generate let's see if some consensus emerges around those things, because the immediate things, if we go through a long process and wait, then the immediate things won't be immediate. So everyone, if you don't mind, take a minute or so, read through that. I read it very quickly, and then I'm going to open the floor to the general question of, are there immediate funding actions that the city can take right now, and that is within the next 1 to 6 months?
It's too small for me to read.
Joy, if you go into the chat,
It will be in
Lyle
there.
provided a link.
Okay,
That link, if you click on that, will give
Okay.
you your full screen of it. So you'll probably get a fatter one that you can look
And that
at.
might, for panelists, that might be a better way to do it anyway. That way you can scroll through the whole document rather than having me in control of it. I'm happy to keep it up on the screen, but you probably want to be in control of it yourself. But so let me ask that question. Are there immediate implementation items that staff and or council can take up right now with regard to funding?
Yes.
I would note that transparency is already underway and contracted out.
Yeah, I would
Okay.
agree that, but the transparency is a very important piece because, thank you, Brian. Because all of that, we've got to have some sort of system in place to measure all of this, and the consultants are working on that, and you know, DCM Sanders has got that very high on his list. So, but I think, yeah, that's an immediate and underway, so I agree.
Okay. What else? No bad answers here. Throw your ideas on the table. Let's see what consensus emerges.
What are the realities of the $10 million a year? Is that?
It's a
You know,
good
Frank makes a good-
question.
yeah.
You know, I don't know that the 10 million would not be, I don't, if we're looking at the next 1 to 6 months, maybe it's at the tail end of the 6 months during next year's CIP process. But you know, I would suggest that probably even ahead of that is that there's an unspent balance in the CAF. And so I think one of the immediate things that potentially, and this is not getting around your question, Frank, but maybe talking about a strategy in concert with that question is perhaps an immediate allocation of some of the funding to things like tenant protections, right to counsel, et cetera. And then also an immediate issuance of an RFP so that people can actually access the balance of what's in the CAF right now. And maybe Phil.
So Dan, it reads though, identify sustainable and reliable source of funding to sustain it. So what are the reliable source?
Well, the most reliable source of funding obviously is the CIP or the general fund.
CIP,
okay.
okay.
I mean, you know, and I'm saying from a practical standpoint, not from a political standpoint, or even perhaps the best governance standpoint, but the one thing that the city can control is its rate of taxation and what it spends its money on. And so city councilors get to vote on a CIP every year, and they get to vote on a budget. And if they choose to put that 10 million in, they can. And if there's not enough money to pay for everything, they can choose to raise taxes. That's a call that's well above my pay grade. That's for the elected officials. But if it's something that, in terms of parsing for a city manager, what can be done, that can be done. Does that make sense, Joy? I'm not sure I answered your question.
Yeah, somewhat.
So if we're looking at sort of the 1 to 6 months, that puts us into early 2022. But I will point out that one sort of hard, absolute drop dead precipice, cut your throat, no negotiation deadline we're dealing with is March LIHTC submissions. And, you know, PHA is going to come barreling down the pike with their next round. So one of the priorities is to make sure the city is
RHA
prepared.
is too.
Yeah, right. And that that the new council has got to, you know, front and center for new council, January, February is spitting out a commitment for those.
Yeah, Juan, maybe you know this better than I do, but can that happen before the budget process? And maybe Brian, you know this. I don't know. Maybe Alex knows this.
The approval of for the LIHTC funds, or what?
Yeah, so I don't know if they need a hard approval or just simply there has to be some evidence that the city has approved. And I wish Sunshine were on.
But the LIHTC fund is not through the city. The LIHTC fund is through the state.
Yeah. So
But there needs to be a city match or a city commitment in order to leverage the LIHTC applications.
Okay, that was.
Well, that's not always the case. It's better to have one because it makes you more competitive, but you don't have to have one to submit an application.
Gotcha.
No, and you don't actually have to have the funding, right? All you really need is a letter from the city saying they support the project. You don't have to
Okay.
have cash.
Right, but of course, the council would like to know roughly what their cash out when they're saying, we think we're doing this, we encourage it. They'd like to know the number that they're quote committing unquote to when they write
Yeah,
it.
for sure. Agreed. But they don't have to dole the cash out at that point.
Correct. I'm just saying that we want to be in a position where we're not in a scramble to produce that. That requires a certain amount of bandwidth from staff, from council, and the coordination. So you wanted to know what was 6 months out. Well, that's 6 months out now.
So what about something like this as an immediate action item, draft the fiscal year 23 CIP that includes funding for a city match or a city allocation for CRHA and PHA next round of LIHTC applications, which would enable the city then to write a commitment letter or a support letter. John, is that enough to have that in the draft CIP? Sounds like it is.
Yeah, it's more than enough. Because if you think about it, the typical project, you get funded, you get LIHTC funding, and then you go find the rest of the funding to close all the gaps. Right. So you're talking about a year after you get the award anyway of even getting the closing to where the city would need to have the money available.
Gotcha. So are you saying that it's not necessary to put it in the CIP for fiscal year 23, or give me your honest insight?
If you're submitting an application in 22, you would want to have the money at least available by 24, because it's going to take you a year to close up the rest of the funding to close. And your city money might be the first, but the way the city has a structure now, it's not going out. All the money isn't going out within the first couple draws. I mean, they're spreading it out, at least with us anyway.
Okay. So John, tell me, sort of as our resident expert and CRHA rep, what in terms of making a recommendation for 1 to 6 months in terms of funding, or even 1 to 18 months, how would you memorialize this in a recommendation to the city manager's office so that you make sure that you've got what you need to leverage your application?
So if we're submitting an application, which we are for 6th Street in March, I would ask for the funding to be available in 2024. So I need a commitment letter and a support letter from the city saying, hey, we support this project because it meets our comprehensive plan and goals of producing more affordable housing. Plus, we are committing funding to it as well. And then that commitment letter is really what's going to be needed for the bank to close up all the loans on the project.
Gotcha. So part of the recommendation could be a 5-year CIP that shows the second year with funding for to leverage the CRHA 6th Street LIHTC application.
Yes. Okay. And I think they have it in their CIP already for that particular project.
Okay. And do you know the status of that for, again, I don't see Sunshine on the line. Do you know the status of PHA? Are they in the same? I'm guessing the timing is the same for them.
I spoke with Sunshine yesterday when he sort of called this to my attention, and the answer to the question is yes.
Spoke to Sunshine. He didn't speak to John.
So again, they need commitment letter next year, but funding showing up in the CIP in 2024.
The chair?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, but his real concern was, get the commitment letter out. And that sort of fits into our time frame of a new council in January can do that, and it's that council, so we're good.
Okay. And so what do folks think about the idea of an RFP right now for the unspent balance, for the existing balance of the CAF?
So can you just back up a minute? So Phil, did you say that the commitment letters are out and so we're good? You don't?
No, ma'am. What I'm saying is that if we're on a 6-month, we're looking at what can we do in the next 6 months and what are the big issues.
Right.
In January, we have a new council.
Mm-hmm.
John and Sunshine need love from that council by March when they make their submission. So we want to make sure that we have dedicated the resources And
Gotcha.
enough in that council can bless a commitment in February.
Got you.
Which I think what I'm hearing is that the funding has to show up in the second year of the 5-year CIP that's presented to council for the next phase of each of the two entities redevelopments.
Yeah, that's
Somebody
my
correct me if
general
I'm wrong.
impression. John's in a better position to.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, all right, I can memorialize that. So I'll go back to the question again. I don't know if it's getting traction or not, but there was a $1.2 million or something like that balance in the CAF. There was an RFP that was about to go out, and then that was pulled back, I think, by the previous city manager, given the onset of COVID. But I presume that balance is still sitting in the CAF account, and there are a number of unspent mandates from home rehab to new projects to potentially other LIHTC to home ownership. Phil, do you have any insight into that? Is that money still in the balance of the CAF?
They got money in.
I do not have any insight to that, but I'm hoping that Brenda might.
Is Brenda on the call?
She
Yeah.
is.
I am. So the CAF balance is about 800 to 850,000. And that's based on the new allocation that was available July 1st. Our direction right now is that is on hold until we get further notice from administration. And I can also address a little bit about the LIHTC application funding if you want me to go into that a little bit.
That'd be great, thanks.
Okay, so typically when our CIP process comes up, we get with Sunshine directly to talk about what dollars he's previously asked for going forward, and is that still on schedule?
Okay.
So the information we have in the CIP request for Friendship Court is working directly with Sunshine on what that amount should be. And the city council previously offered kind of a commitment to Housing Authority about what that funding would look like going forward. So that's still proposed in the CIP. But what happens is the city council doesn't approve the budget until like April-ish. And Friendship Court and CRHA need these commitments shown around February-ish or for their application process. So the city has come up with a letter basically showing support because they can't guarantee that funding if it hasn't been approved by the city council, but has this kind of standard letter now that we offer to PHA and CRHA when they asked for it, that they include in their packages. So we already have a process kind of in place to address the funding amount and the support of the funding that goes with the LIHTC applications.
Thank you, Brenda. That was helpful. I'm seeing from Brian that the CIP is going to be in front of the Planning Commission November and December. So I think that there is a short-term recommendation. If if you boiled all the recommendations in the housing report or the housing plan to maybe the most impactful, it was the $10 million a year fund to support affordable housing. So I would proffer to the group that if there's one pressing thing that the city manager's office needs to do now to be consistent with this plan is to develop a draft CIP that has that $10 million annual commitment in there, and that $10 million stays stable for 5 years, because the recommendation in the plan was a 10-year, $10 million each year commitment.
Hey.
Yes.
Any objections to that?
No.
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 Dan, coming back to the CAF funds,
Yep.
I guess maybe this is a question for Brenda. My understanding is that the city's rent relief funds have been used.
That is correct. So basically the only CAF funding we have right now is the new allocation that became available July 1st.
From the state?
No, that's city money.
Oh, city money. So
Yeah.
is there any expectation that any of that rent, that any additional rent relief funding will be available between now and the end of the year? Because that continues to be an
Hold
issue.
on.
Not that I'm aware of, but there may be other state funding sources that are coming with the COVID that I'm not aware of.
Hey, Frank, are you not connected with the state rent relief program?
We are,
'Cause
yeah.
I think they have, 10 million or 100 million. They have some crazy amount of money available. So I doubt the city's going to do anything, because we
Okay.
talked one point about it, what would happen, and I was told the state is funding it, so it's not something that will get a lot of local money.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, we have not had much exposure to the state, to I guess it's DHCD. But I appreciate the clarification on what the city's doing.
Hey, Frank, we were able to get connected. If you all would like to meet with our finance people to see how we were able, because we've received a fair amount from the state already to cover back rent. If you want to connect with some of our folks,
Okay.
I can make that happen.
Okay, that's great, John. Appreciate it.
Okay, so moving down the list here, we've got the first bullet of scale, kind of banked as a recommendation. And then partially consistency, the idea is that we're looking for the CIP to show in its 5-year projection, 10 million each year across the multiple initiatives, which now include, I'm starting to kind of call them entitlement initiatives and other initiatives. I sort of feel like the CRHA, the PHA initiatives are almost sort of entitlement initiatives, as are even though we know these are year-to-year commitments, but as are vouchers, rent relief, et cetera. But in the plan, it did also talk about, I think, roughly 30 to 35%, 3 to 3.5 million to 4 million or so in available for new initiatives, new projects to fund everything else that's not one of the entitlement projects. Am I remembering that right? So if I am remembering that right, I would suggest that potentially part of our recommendation would be to have a diversified CIP that reflects commitments to the sort of entitlement programs, but also leaves money available for some of the things that have been unfunded over the last few years. Along with that, I was wondering if we could get an update from somebody on what the status is of the IAT, because if I read the consistency bullet point, identifying sustainable and reliable sources of dedicated funding, that's really about having a longer range plan so that projects that may have a runway of 3 or 4 years can go ahead and get themselves in the queue and can be able to say, okay, yeah, we're not gonna need this money now, but to make this happen, we need a commitment a few years hence. Does anybody have a status update on the IAT? Because I think that could be part of the recommendation for immediate funding actions in terms of adoption of it formally.
Rory was in the audience at one point, but I don't think he is at the moment. My recollection is that late in the year, they made some adjustments to it. And the anticipation is that this implementation tool is going to integrate into the IAT. So, and we volunteered Rory and Ridge both to assist in that effort.
So is that a deliverable that the HAC could deliver to coincide with the CIP process, Phil, to produce an IAT that could then be connected to the CIP?
I mean, I'll happily obligate Ridge and Rory for their assistance in that. So
And then,
an answer yes. I mean,
when Brenda, I mean, do you think that's something that what's the time frame for getting that something like that in front of council for formal adoption?
Our CIP requests are, I think, from staff due by the end of this month.
Okay,
And then as Brian wrote, when the CIP is going to Planning Commission. So basically, the end of this month is, as far as I'm concerned, when we as staff have to have in all our requests.
I got you. So then thinking this forward a little bit, there's no time to have the IAT in front of that process, but assuming the CIP has money allocated across the housing continuum, if the IAT were recommended by the HAC and adopted by council in time for the issuance of the RFP for CAF funding next year, then those things could time. So perhaps one of our deliverables could be the HAC presents a formal IAT structure to council by, I don't know, January or something like that, with the idea of it being adopted by council, should they choose to do so, in time to inform the CAF funding allocation process next year.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's also sort of an inevitability, if this works right, that we're going to drag the IAT's methodology into the implementation anyway. I would hope.
Okay.
So
I'm just writing notes, I'm sorry. Anything else people want to say about funding? I'm kind of thinking what we'll do, we only have about 20 minutes left, and that we'll get as far as we can with the obvious things. We're only going to get through, if at best, funding and governance, and then we hold the next meeting and we work our way through through land use, et cetera. Although maybe we want to do land use first because Planning Commission is voting on it this week. Phil, what's your pleasure?
yeah, I think as far as getting through this, if we want to hit something in this meeting as sort of a chunk of things to talk about, that's probably it. But also, I think in order to expedite the process, we may want to sort of think about how we assemble the rest of this in the next meeting too. Sort of talk a little bit about process in terms of what homework we do and sort of prep for it as well. So that when we do have a sit down, and I think this can come up in the HAC as early as next week, and then one more run through of recommendations, and not get too deep into the weeds of all of it, but just give. I mean, I think that we need to look at the process too. So I think land use and process and how to complete this process are probably our two big bullet points now.
Okay, well, let's flip to land use, keep ourselves, if we can, it's ridiculous, to a ridiculously short period of about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll use our final 5 minutes or so to talk about process going forward. And I apologize, I know this is a hard session to participate in, and I apologize for my leadership of it. I didn't really understand the remit until the meeting started today. So
right.
I do, having said that, I do think we're making progress here, but I appreciate everybody bearing with me. So now turning to the focus to land use summary recommendations. Brian, could you bring that up on the screen? Thank you. So Lyle, I don't know, do you want to lead a sort of overview of kind of where we are? Some of these things are already a little bit outdated because the Planning Commission and the community have already gone past some of this stuff and are at a different place. Lyle, do you want to give us a sort of summary of what you think the pivotal action items are right now?
This is, again, completely underway. All of this is happening right now in the future land use map. And in the draft chapters, which has seen a lot of changes and evolution in recent months. All of these principles, in my opinion, are still in there. ADUs for sure. ADUs are, you could call them granny flats, more affordable, smaller accessory homes within an existing home, no tear downs required. Soft density by right is definitely in the plan. It's been in every iteration. Instead of only allowing detached single-family homes with large lots in much of the city, allowing still sort of similar scale, but more affordable home types allowing more flexibility. And multifamily by right is in there. Not a lot of expansion in the current future land use map, but it is there. And inclusionary zoning, there's been a lot of back and forth on that. In many ways, it's expanded. I've seen proposals to expand it to every single category, and we may see that. I'm not sure. Also, there's this newer idea of the I'm losing it.
The overlay.
Overlay, an affordable housing overlay, which could be allow additional capacity if there's some sort of proven affordable element. Maybe height, maybe more homes allowed, maybe fewer burdens like parking. That's what I see, and it's happening.
Thanks. So I think, as I look at this list and then I think about, I sat through almost all of the planning commission meeting last time. It felt like there was I know, crazy. There seemed to be pretty clear direction. I think I counted 4, potentially 5 planning commissions that said we want to see an overlay in the future citywide overlay in the future land use map. I don't want to overstate that because obviously full disclosure, I had something to do with drafting the general parameters of an overlay. So I want to make sure I'm not overstating what seems to be support for it. Lyle, can you comment on that honestly?
I heard that from the planning commission, and I heard very much the same thing from the steering committee the next day.
Okay. So in terms of immediate burning issues, would it be, as I think with Lyle, the overlay encompasses much of this stuff already, right? I'm trying to figure out because a lot of these, I'm trying to figure out what we can send forward in terms of land use recommendations for immediate implementation. And the only thing that comes up in my mind is either inclusionary zoning or the overlay as part of the future land use map.
Lyle, has there been any specificity discussed around any of these, just in terms of how they might manifest in actual zoning text amendments, zoning code text amendments?
All very conceptual.
So could one of the recommendations be pass a flum by, I don't know, what's the quickest it could go forward? November, October? Are you all going to be actually voting on the future land use map on Tuesday, Lyle?
No, October, council in November.
That seems like, again, one of those fairly obvious things. Adopt a future land use map with the principles of the, incorporating principles of the housing plan by November. I mean, any objection to that? I mean, it's again, a fairly obvious and innocuous one.
Yeah, agreed.
Any objection to that?
No.
I mean, I'm still, we can go forward and move. This is us discussing this and kind of hashing it out, but I really haven't had a lot of time to dig into this, to be quite honest. And I've been juggling around a lot of things to attend this meeting. So I know that these are some recommendations, but over the weekend, when I have more time to dive into this, I may come forward with other recommendations. Just want to have that, put that on the table. And I think that's fair.
Thanks, Jess. Oh, absolutely. It's fair. No, I fully recognize this was a lot to digest in the middle of a meeting while we're talking about it. So to Phil's point, I'd like to spend most of the balance of the meeting just talking about process, what people need in order to get to a place where the next time we meet, we can have a more efficient meeting. And so I've got some ideas, but I'd rather open it up to the floor. What do you all need in terms of whether it's homework or preparation or documents to allow us to have a more robust and informed discussion about the other categories of recommendations, governments, tenants' rights, land use, etc.
I think it's always helpful to have these questions that you're asking us now prior to us coming to the meetings, where we've had time to vet the questions, look over the documents, and feel fully engaged in the conversation.
Gotcha. Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
to be clear and transparent, the original intent of this meeting was to sort of structure that, say, here's our problem. Let's discuss what the problem is. Here is the substance of it to look at. Go forth and rummage, and the next time we'll dive down into it. So the idea is we got our 3 buckets. This is what city management wants. Here's the material we've got to look at. Let's, you know, give a little bit of thought of how we can address it. And then next round, we then come in, you know, with a fistful of, okay, I've looked at this. Here are the 7 things that I think we cannot possibly do before 2023. Here's why. And, you know, or whatever, you know, and then.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, and I apologize, at least I jumped the shark a little bit by getting into getting into content, partially to see if there was if there were some sort of easy wins, easy things where there's consensus. But I think probably. So, well, tell me, Lisa, what would help you feel like you have the ability to be more fully engaged next time? What would help you in the interim between, I heard you say questions.
Yeah, I mean, like you're asking questions now. Hey, you know what, when we get our next meeting, these are questions that I'm going to pose. Think about them in advance so that you can look over the material and come prepared. And if you have any additional comments or you see prioritizing differently, then, you know, I have time to vet my thoughts. And I have time to pull on different materials if I need to.
Makes sense. So it seems to me like the list of questions are pretty simple. It's read the set of recommendations in the housing plan pages. And I would actually recommend, rather than the executive summary, that we go to the full list of recommendations and then come prepared on a category by category basis, from funding to governance to land use to tenants' rights to subsidy to say what should be that priorities in the next 6 months, priorities from 6 to 18 months, and then 3 to 5 years. And we'll compare
and
notes.
just to piggyback on the comment about, you know, some of the questions might be obvious. We're all coming from this, the majority of us are coming from this from different perspectives, and that's a good thing. So I would not want you to assume that I know anything. I want you to just let it be open, and if you need to, and that's the same because the public would normally be listening in on this as well. So it's not just for our benefit. We want the public to be as engaged and as informed. I think sometimes we throw around acronyms and things, assuming that everybody in the audience, the public, understands everything. So that also goes to full transparency. If people don't understand what you're talking about, you can assume you have full transparency. So I would rather you, for lack of a better way to say it, dumb it down, rather than assuming that everybody is on the same accord and coming from the same perspective. That's all.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to circle back, the one specific framing that we got from Mr. Sanders was his time frame is what can we fiddle with one way or the other by the end of the calendar year. 1, 2, by the end of the fiscal year, June. 3, after that. So that's the framework that he's looking for. And some of these, and we do have an implementation timeline in here, and it might be helpful if at least to start with that. And we know we're going to mark that up because it's just not going to come all, I mean, good effort, but it was written months ago. Things have changed. We've accomplished some things. Some things are completely off the radar now. Whatever. I mean, but it's not bad that they've got it sort of organized, and we might as well, start chopping that up, I think.
I think I kind of have, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, are we to ignore the city's limitations in actually achieving any of those objectives, just debate based on staff availability or other priorities, or are we to ignore that in terms of what our recommendations are, or are there any guide rails that?
No, I think one of the guide rails has got to be, what is, it's priorities and practicality, right? I mean, priority wise, we want all sorts of things that are not in the realm of the possible to happen in the next 6 months. But, we don't have the staff, we don't have the money, so those aren't going to happen. One of the things I would suggest as a crash priority for by the end of the year, for example, is the appropriate staffing and hiring, so that when this starts flooding out next year, we can grapple with it. I mean, and I think, Mr. Sanders is clear on that too. I mean, that's front and center in his own mind. But
Phil,
I
can
think,
I ask you something, Phil? So, from your understanding, while we're doing this process, we are to consider the current barriers. And when we're looking and evaluating, setting priorities, we should be thinking about staff and all that, and not just what we think should truly be priorities. So we need to get into the weeds and keep all of that into consideration.
yes, ma'am. I mean, in general, for example, for the end of the year, none of this can really be about real money, right? Because we can't go get real money by now at the end of the year. But what are our available funds? We have some cap, do we want to push the cap? Yeah, you're right. We have to think about the practicalities, particularly for the end of the year, that we don't, I'd love to stand up these 6 programs right now. Who's going to do it? With what money? So, okay, well, what can we do in the next 6 months? We can finish this, we can do that, we can hire people.
So is that not going to allow us to always be in the same position? Because we're always doing the same thing?
What do you mean?
In terms of if we're always considering the staff and what we think which should be added to the budget, how any of this ever going to change?
Well, I guess what I meant by that is
back on what's always been done.
Right. Well, I think that it's a particular case from now to the end of the year, right, where there is not really a practical way to go get more funding or stand things up. But what are the things that do not have a significant cost or already budgeted for that is already underway that we can do? That's one category for the end of the calendar year. Going forward, there is presumably, we have a $10 million commitment here, so we can start looking at that more substantively.
And I guess that's more of what I'm concerned about. Yeah, a little more long term. Yeah,
exactly. But for the end of the year, these are the immediate, I don't want to call them easy wins, but these are immediate things that we can do. Like, hey, we can do this right now. Don't worry. That says it's 18 months out. We can actually do that now. Let's do it.
All right, so I'm going to play timekeeper here. We've got about 2 minutes left, and I apologize. I noticed it was uncovered in my chat. It was covered up by screen share that somebody, I think Rory had his hand raised at 3:50. Brian, is Rory still on it? Does he have his hand raised, and or are there other members of the public that want to address us?
Rory is no longer in the audience, but we do have one audience member, and but I don't see a hand raised at this time.
Okay. Would that member of the audience who I don't see like to make a comment?
Kathleen, if you want to click the raise hand icon, we'll bring you into the conversation. And here she comes.
Oh, I'm fine. I've been texting John all my comments so he can send a nice big email. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I think I've gotten marching orders, and I think, Lisa, I appreciate it. I think you made it pretty clear. I think what I will do is try to summarize I think the questions are the questions, and the homework is the homework. The homework is to read the list of recommendations, and then come prepared to talk about what you think we can accomplish by the end of the calendar year, by the end of the fiscal year, and then after that. And we'll ground our conversation next time by working through the different categories that way. Does that make sense to everybody?
And as part of that, can we request that staff review this and provide their own feedback? Again, to Lisa's point, I don't want to, there's no sense going through this and then finding out that staff can't do any of the things that we're recommending for whatever reason. Seems like it'd be helpful to understand what the, you know, what their limitations are, what they think's realistic, because that's going to obviously have an impact on what gets done.
Bill, can I ask you to reach out to Sam and
I
get that?
absolutely can reach out to Sam. I'll tell you that part of what Sam wants to get a sense of it, I mean, it's
Yeah.
the snake is eating its own tail there. I mean, he wants to get a sense of what we can get accomplished and then back into how can we actually pull the trigger on that and marshal resources that are available to do it. That's less true for the end of the year, but those are, you know, quick snaps. But for the fiscal year piece where there is some money still moving around, yes. And then after that. So this is really to assist a planning tool and budget planning for city management as well. They want to know how to point themselves a little bit. So but this is going to be a summary process. Let's be clear. You know, we want to get this out in the next couple of weeks and be done with it, and then immediately turn our attention to the next level of detail and depth of each one of these and how to stand them up and move them forward. And then that's really where staff is going to be neck deep in it. That's sort of the next step. This is, you know, this is just sort of a very broad reach of how to point the how to point the city towards these resources.
All right, so we're over time. Unless, are there final comments before we adjourn?
Rory's back.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for purposes of this, for what we're this exercise, Phil, then can we kind of disregard the staff piece? Because we don't know what that is.
I don't want to be unquoted as saying disregard staff. I don't want to go on record for that, but yeah.
This, I think what you're saying, Frank, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but to maybe to frame it, say it a different way, is to make the recommendations independent of staff capacity at the time.
Yeah.
So that the city manager's office can make decisions about staffing, and they will, if there's not enough capacity, they'll cut stuff from this list because they simply can't get it done. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Thank you for putting it more eloquently.
It wasn't more eloquent. Anyway, I appreciate everyone bearing with us as we found our footing in the process. I thought it was a productive hour. I will summarize the questions, give people homework assignments, send it through you, Phil, to send to the HAC, and we'll move on from there.
Yeah, and we'll have a brief summary of this next week, and then look at a meeting in a week or two after that to sort of really dive in and get this done. So I will see, we'll see you all next Wednesday.
All right. Thanks again, everybody, for your time. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brenda. Thanks, Alex.
John had his hand up.
Yeah, John has his hand up.
Oh, all right, John.
One quick question. Did we ever get it? Was there an update on the housing program coordinator search?
Was there an update? Well, I hope to have a more substantive one next week when we have an NDS director, our new NDS director around. But the answer to that is no. I guess was there one? The answer to that question is no.
Okay. See you, everyone.
Bye-bye.